Good evening, everyone. My name is Kayla Hopper, and I'm Director of Outreach at the American Antiquarian Society. For those of you who have joined us before, thanks for joining us again. For those who are new to AAS programs, welcome. We're very happy to have you joining us. As we do like we have some people here who are new to us, let me quickly introduce the Antiquarian Society. We are a national research library of American history and culture whose mission is to collect, preserve, and share the printed record of what is now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean before the 20th century. In doing so, we collect anything and everything printed within these parameters, from graphic prints and ephemera to newspapers and periodicals to pamphlets and books. We use these collections as the basis for all of our programs, such as this one. AAS is located in Worcester, Massachusetts, and sits on the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, which continues to thrive here in central Massachusetts. The Nipmuc community today is centered at the Hassanamiska Reservation in what is now Grafton, Massachusetts. As tonight's program, Where Are the Birds? Rediscovering and Restoring the Landscapes of John James Audubon will demonstrate, the continuing vibrancy of Native communities throughout the country is central to both deepening and complicating our knowledge of history and of historical figures, such as John James Audubon, as well as moving forward in meaningful ways. Before I move to introducing tonight's speakers, I'm going to ask my colleague, Amanda Kondek, to describe some of the features of Zoom we will be using for tonight's program. Amanda will be helping out behind the scenes throughout the evening. Amanda?
Thank you, Kayla. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I have just a few notes on how we'll be using the Zoom webinar format tonight. For the Q&A portion of the program, we'll be using the Q&A function and not the chat box. By using the Q&A function, we'll be able to keep track of the questions, and it also has an upvote option. So if someone posts a question you want to see discussed, be sure to upvote it by clicking on the thumbs up icon. You can place your questions in the Q&A function at any time during the presentation. Due to the large number of attendees, the chat box will be used only for informational purposes. Throughout the program, I'll be posting relevant links and information, and you can contact us there if there are any technical difficulties we should know about. If you would like to save the chat to have the links for future use, you can save a transcription of it by clicking on the three dots in the chat window. Closed captioning is also available as an option for tonight's program via Zoom's live transcription function. You can turn the closed captioning on and off with the button labeled CC. And finally, we are recording this program and we'll make it available on our website and YouTube channel for viewing later. Thank you, Kayla.
Thanks, Amanda. And now for tonight's speakers. I am joined by visual artist, author, and activist Krista Elrick, who will be interviewed by historian Gregory Nobles. Krista has been an exhibiting artist and activist for more than 35 years and is interested in the changes that have occurred in natural ecosystems over prolonged periods of time as a direct result of human intrusion into the landscape. Film-based in-camera exposures combined with silver gelatin prints are the foundation of her creative work. Her recent projects include Imagine a City That Remembers, the Albuquerque Reef Photography Project, and Grasslands Separating Species, which was published in conjunction with an exhibition at 516 Arts in Albuquerque. Krista received an MFA from Arizona State University in 1990 and held a J. and Deborah Last Creative Artist Fellowship at AAS in 2016. This fellowship program for creative and performing artists and writers at AAS celebrated its 25th anniversary in 2020. These fellowships provide the opportunity for uninterrupted time for historical research at the Society for creative and performing artists, writers, filmmakers, journalists, and others whose goals are to produce imaginative works dealing with pre-20th century history, literature, and American culture. To find out more about the Creative Artist Fellowships, check out our website featuring the projects of fellows from the past 25 years. Amanda can share that link in the chat. Gregory Nobles is Professor of History Emeritus at the Georgia Institute of Technology, where he spent 33 years as a faculty member and administrator. His most recent book is a biography of Audubon called John James Audubon, The Nature of the American Woodsman, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2017. He is also the author of an article published in Audubon magazine in July 2020 called The Myth of John James Audubon, which focuses on Audubon's slaveholding and views on race. Greg was elected to AS membership in 1995 and has served in a variety of roles, most recently as Distinguished Scholar in Residence during the 2016-2017 academic year. It's a pleasure to have both of you back under AAS's virtual dome. We'll begin the program with a short film Krista has produced about her project, after which she and Greg will discuss the project further. We'll end the program with open Q&A from all of you, so do please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A function at any time. I am going to turn it over to Krista to say a few words before we start the film. Krista?
Thank you and good evening. Thank you for joining this conversation. And I just wanted to say a few words of thank you to the American Antiquarian Society, especially Isaiah Thomas, for having the vision to incorporate a society in 1812 that would contribute to the advancement of arts and sciences. I want to thank Jay and Deborah Last for their support of my creative fellowship. Also to Philip Gura, who initially introduced me to the American Antiquarian Society. His important bicentennial history of AAS is a page-turning, thoroughly researched examination of the society. Philip graciously guided me through the application process. I also want to thank James Moran, who's better known as Jim to me. Jim gently guided me through every stage of the fellowship. He also introduced me to Gregory Nobles. And Jim wrote a foreword to my book, and I'm excited to hear that he's actually attending this evening's presentation. Good evening, Jim. Also to Lauren Hughes, the Curator of Graphic Arts. Lauren gave me access to extremely rare period maps and banknotes. Her support and assistance throughout the process is the gold standard in the field. Thank you so very much. And finally to Ed Curry, who greeted me most mornings as I entered the dome. Ed was so curious about my project, and he always asked me how my research was doing and if I was finding gems in the collection. Ed reminded me of my dad. Who always loved to meet new people and was also a medical doctor who cared for the health of others. My condolences to the family, and I just think only fond memories of Dr. Curry. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to the video and to have a conversation with Gregory Nobles. Thank you. My name is Krista Elrick, and I am a visual artist and an activist. Through the course of my career, I have worked with Indigenous peoples, cancer survivors, and advocated for the environment. I am also an avid hiker who loves to learn about birds. I have long been aware of John James Audubon being an impressive historical character and a troubling one. Several years ago, I read his journals about his travels. I was dumbstruck by his descriptions of the landscapes of his time, which were filled with birds and other species, so many of which are now lost to us. My mind burned with the question, where are the birds? I wanted to experience firsthand the exact places that Audubon traveled through and how much they had changed in the course of 200 years since he was there. So with my Hasselblad film camera in hand, I set off to retrace Audubon's steps through Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Mississippi, Louisiana, the Carolinas, Florida, then to Missouri, Montana, and the Dakotas. After nearly 10 years, I ended my trip at Audubon's gravesite at Trinity Cemetery in New York City after traveling more than 45,000 miles. The result is my book, A Country No More, Rediscovering the Landscapes of John James Audubon. This video will give you a taste of that journey in the book and of Audubon's work and its surprising and continued relevance for our time.
When I think of these times and call back to my mind the grandeur and beauty of those almost uninhabited shores, when I picture to myself the dense and lofty summits of the forest that everywhere spread along the hills and overhung the margins of the stream, unmolested by the axe of the settler, when I know how dearly purchased the safe navigation of that river has been by the blood of many worthy Virginians, when I see that no longer any aborigines are to be found there, and that the vast herds of elks, deer, and buffaloes, which once pastured on these hills and in these valleys, make for themselves great roads to the several salt springs, have ceased to exist. When I reflect that all this grand portion of our Union, instead of being in a state of nature, is now more or less covered with villages, farms, and towns, where the din of hammers and machinery is constantly heard, that the woods are fast disappearing under the axe by day and the fire by night, that hundreds of steamboats are gliding to and fro over the whole length of the majestic river, forcing commerce to take root and to prosper at every spot. When I see the surplus of population of Europe coming to assist in the destruction of the forest and transplanting civilization into its darkest recesses, when I remember that these extraordinary changes have all taken place in the short period of 20 years, I pause, wonder, and although I know all to be fact, can scarcely believe its reality.
My relationship with birds began as a metaphor. It touched me deeply about the use of birds in this way of living and passing with cancer. And I started photographing birds and looking for birds and researching about birds and where could I find these birds. At one point, someone asked me, have you ever read anything about John James Audubon? And to be honest, I had vaguely heard of his name. I was vaguely familiar with his bird pictures, and if I read his journals, maybe I'll find the birds that I want to photograph. I spent a good 2 years reading Audubon's journals and began to understand that Audubon was not the hero that I had thought, nor was the landscape anywhere close to what it was like in his time. I was coming to terms with the incredible change the landscape had taken in the years between his life and mine.
One of the important points in Krista's book is how the built environment and the natural environment has changed over the last 150, 160 years. When Krista was looking for the birds and not finding them, part of not finding them was, or is, the change in the landscape and the change in the built environment and how humans have disrupted the migratory pattern of the birds.
Krista asked me to do the still life components in the book. We were in the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. I photographed the now extinct Carolina parakeet. And although dead, its feathers are still vibrant and jewel-like, which adds even further poignancy to its extinction.
Many of the birds that Audubon was painting have disappeared. The landscape has changed. The birds are gone.
I was starting out with field work where I'm going to be at the exact same place that he wrote in his journal, or where I can definitively say he was there, and where he described an enormous flock of birds and see what I saw. And there weren't the flocks, and there were empty skies. And that's when I realized I needed to really look at the landscape again, the ecosystems that are there to support birds, and the trees became my subject matter.
I was intrigued by the way she was making her photographs and the length of the project, that she'd committed so much of her life and time and resources, and the amount of research that she'd done on Audubon's life. In addition to what was going on in his life, but what was happening in the United States at the time, and how important looking at his history was to understanding American history.
I learned about the American Antiquarian Society and their collection of enormous amounts of visual material and period maps in the Americas up until the mid-1800s. And I knew then that that could help me place him in his time. Pre-Civil War banknotes was the currency of the time. In the United States, there was no federal currency. And so these banknotes are very local, and every community could have as many as they wanted. It was all dependent on who was giving the money. They're so visual and clear about what the aspirations are for the economy of the future. It's like the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and that changes the lifestyle for birds. That changes the ecosystem for birds in a way that we see the losses that we see in 2021, living in the age of extinction.
One thing that the book did that's so important is contextualize Krista's photographs, Audubon's drawings and paintings with the banknotes of the time. And you start to see this artwork wasn't created in a vacuum. The banknotes tell us something about the economy of the time, the culture of the time, the role of Native Americans at the time, the role of women at the time, the role of African Americans at the time, most of whom were slaves at that time.
To me, it was really like learning about this man, learning about Krista's relationship to his journey, about Krista's relationship to the land.
And it's going to introduce people to a lot of concepts that they haven't been introduced to yet in this way that are hugely timely. The environmental concerns, the indigenous concerns, as well as maybe even touches on things like Black Lives Matter in its own little way.
I came and visited Krista a couple times in her studio and looked at her images. And Krista had a million ideas, and she'd had done so much work. There were so many avenues we could have taken for the Northlight exhibition. I personally remember a moment when she was explaining and giving me options, and I just said, what do you really want to do? What do you want this show to be? And she said, I want to be an activist.
Audubon was pre-Industrial Revolution, and I'm doing this post-climate change, and so it's just a brief period of time of 200 years, and we've gone from one extreme to the next, and it's worth, talking about and better understanding so that we can know how to recover and potentially bring back some birds.
As climate change happens and there's less and less snowfall, it leads to less and less water all the way down in the middle of the ground, less water for people to use, less water for the environment, for different species, for birds.
The challenge with climate change is how do we keep these river systems alive and working? But I think it's got to start with that the river systems are important in themselves. Coupled with that would be the engaging with the indigenous communities and the older Hispanic communities along the Rio Grande, understanding how they've dealt with drought in the past.
We need to conserve, and we need to think about the future, as we get more and more dry years, we need to think about how is this water being used and who is being affected by the lack of water.
I deeply believe that indigenous knowledge has a millennia of information and experience already under their belt. They have been doing this in the Americas for thousands of years, and that knowledge is key. I hope you have enjoyed this video and it has whetted your appetite to think about how much our landscape and economies have changed over the last 200 years and how we can make a difference in dealing with ethical, environmental conservation, species extinction, and climate change throughout the United States as well as globally. I do believe that art can change perspectives and therefore lives, and that is why I have made this book. I met many amazing people along my journey to rediscover the landscapes of John James Audubon. I want to thank them all, as well as a couple of key mentors to me early in my career. They include Shelly Cohen, former director of the Arizona Commission on the Arts, for whom I worked with in public art policy. Shelly understands how to make big creative ideas come to life. She taught me how to embrace persistence. And Dr. Dave Warren, elder of Santa Clara Pueblo in New Mexico, to whom this book is dedicated. He taught me to think of history as a cubist painting, in the sense that you have to study it from many different perspectives in order to fully understand it. Sometimes it's hard to look at, and not always pretty, but history matters. Thank you.
Well, then I think we shall begin. And I want to, first of all, thank Kayla and Amanda for their important assistance here. And also thank everybody who is Zooming in tonight. It's nice to have a good audience for such a good presentation. But above all, I want to thank Krista, because first for the terrific video presentation we just saw, but especially for the terrific book that she's created. It is striking, it is smart. I found it a joy to behold, even a joy to hold. John James Audubon said of his own volumes of The Birds of America, it took 2 stout arms to raise them from the floor. And this one, I will tell you, it is a pretty heavy lift too. It's a big book, but it's full of some wonderful, wonderful material. I wish we could have one on display here on Zoom, but perhaps we'll do that in some other fashion. But I do have to ask, Krista, what I think is the obvious but still necessary question, and that is, why Audubon? As someone in the video said, you've developed a voracious appetite for Audubon over the course of the years. And I think about why Audubon as opposed to other 19th century American artists, people like Asher B. Durand, Thomas Cole, maybe even George Catlin. So what is it about Audubon that gripped you so?
Well, thank you, Greg. And it is true, Audubon just captured my imagination. And it really began when I caught interest in photographing birds, which I did really when I was 50 years old. I just couldn't get enough of photographing the subjects for all the reasons of metaphoric reasons of their migration and flight and vulnerability and passing. And I wanted to find as many birds that I could photograph as possible. And so I learned about John James Audubon and decided, well, I'm going to go with what the best is. He knows where they are, and so that's how I'll find them. And it was my search for birds to photograph.
Great. You know, Krista, you and I both had fellowships at the American Antiquarian Society in 2016, and I was excited. I was very excited to know that somebody with the Creative Arts Fellowship was working on Audubon. I thought, this is great. But by the time I arrived in the fall of 2016, you had left. And that was a great disappointment to me. It was not the only disappointment of the fall of 2016, but it was up there. It's on my list. So I'll have to ask you now, as I didn't get to ask you then, where was the project when you came to the Antiquarian Society? And where was it when you left? How did your time at AAS really shape the overall nature of the project and the direction of where you're going with A Country No More?
Yeah. Well, I came to AAS in the spring of 2016, as you mentioned, and by then I had already spent about 8 years with Audubon. I had read as much as I could about him in his own journals, but then books that had been published. And unfortunately, I hadn't read yours yet because I don't think that it was out by that time. But I had also completed about 75% of the photographic field work that I had wanted to do. I had been to Mill Grove and Henderson, Kentucky. I had gone down the Ohio River to the confluence of the Mississippi. I went up the Natchez Trace Trail several times to photograph that area because he had walked it, carrying his portfolio. And it is a long trail, 500 miles, if my recollection is correct. I had also visited the Florida Keys and Dry Tortugas. Mm-hmm. And in 2015, I followed his traces along the Missouri River. And so in my mind, I had already formed an opinion about Audubon by the time I came to AAS, but I knew then that I needed some kind of visual imagery to contextualize my work so that I could bring the visitor, the reader, and the viewer of my work to his time so that they could make comparisons while reading it. And so the Aquarian Society has incredible period maps, and that's what I put in my proposal, was to find as many as possible. And that was it was extremely rewarding and easy search, because I was looking for the exact periods of time where Audubon was and the country of origin, and trying to make it as specific as possible to Audubon's biography. And then during evening conversations with other scholars in the residential room, hall, every evening we would chat and talk about what we had learned with all the other scholars. And it was really a rewarding and fun experience to meet historians and other artists from around the country. And that really shaped my thinking. And then I read an essay in a book that is written by Jennifer Roberts, and she wrote a book about transporting visions, the movement of images in the early America. And in it, she used John James Audubon as an example of how he would literally carry, or how he would pack and ship his large portfolio. And in her essay, she included a banknote from 1818 of the Bank of Henderson. And I was amazed because I had photographed Audubon's home site in Henderson, and it is currently now under the ownership of the Bank of Henderson.
Mhm.
And when I saw the banknote and I knew his home site right away, I wanted to know more about the economies of the time and to learn more about the nature of these banknotes. And through the help of many people at the in the dome, and they said, well, we have these banknotes, and I was able to really take a look-see at them and get a sense of the visual material that they provide. And I knew fairly quickly that I wanted to incorporate them. And I remember talking with Jim Moran. I said, Jim, these banknotes are fantastic. May I use them? Would I have permission to use these materials? And he said, yes. And then I said, but Jim, I'm an artist, and I'm going to kind of play around with them. It's not going to be, just a straight documentary of things. It's fine. We have no problem. Use the materials. It's really important. And then I got super excited and really dug deeply into seeing how I could match specific banknotes to places that Audubon was during the year that he was there, so that they became almost original source materials in this layered journey of where we were going together. And so by the time I left the Aquarian Society for my fellowship, I knew I could use the banknotes. I knew I had maps, and I had gotten quite a bit of feedback about the nature of my research, and it was positive, and it made me feel as if, let's continue this, let's make it happen. And so it was transformational for me. I was at a period in my life where I just needed some quiet time to just focus, and AAS provided that for me, and I just couldn't get enough of it. It was great. And the people there are so helpful and kind and understanding and supportive of creative research methods, which now I fully understand how artists do this, and they were open to it. And so I encourage my artist colleagues to consider doing a residency, to do some research, and because it's accepted as a way of integrating visuals into your work, and they're so helpful. And I can't say enough good about the institution and how helpful they were in my work. And had it not happened, this book would not have been completed. I can guarantee that. So I'm so supportive of what AAS is doing for creative artists and everyone in between.
I think the choice of banknotes was a brilliant one, because Audubon's first published piece of art, as it was, was a banknote for a New Jersey bank. And then you used them in such striking ways, sometimes covering over the face of a bird with a banknote. And I think what's delightful is that every page in the book is a surprise. They're just wonderful images and juxtapositions. And I think one of the things I like most about the book is my ability to dip in almost anywhere. I can read some John James Audubon, I can read some Krista Elrick, and above all, look at all the remarkable images you have in the book. And yet I know that the book had a very careful and conscious structure to it. It had a plan. It's not a linear narration. It's not just a series of then and now images. It's a combination of words and images that takes a very evocative and I think very topical approach to Audubon and to his world, and frankly, to our own world as well. So again, I wonder, just again, from the creative side, out of all the ways that you could have made this book, out of all the ways you could have structured and organized the material, how did you come to the one you chose? That's probably an unfair question, but nonetheless, I'll ask it.
Well, to begin with, as a photographer, I was trained as a documentary photographer, I was trained to look critically at my subject matters, to really try to figure out what the subject matter was about that I was pointing my camera at. And it was, again, a critical look. And so since I'm not going to just try to make it beautiful. And so visual storytelling was something that I have done, and I knew I wanted to continue. But I was very resistant to mixing many words with my photographs. As a visual artist, I was trained and actually believe that images can speak for themselves. They don't need words to kind of describe what is going on. And successful images in particular needed fewer words. And so it took me a long while to accept the fact that this particular body of work really does get stronger when it's surrounded by words to help contextualize matters. And the second thing was that Audubon's writings are what attracted me the most. His writing skills, while very productive and perhaps tiresome after a while because there is so much, if you can pick out the gems of what he is saying and let him speak his own mind and sort of let him get himself in trouble, so to speak, about his descriptions of Native Americans and African slaves and situations that he gets himself into. When I began to edit the words that would surround my photographs, by then I was thoroughly upset with the man, and I was very critical of who he was. And so I chose to put in original essays and original words where he again exposed himself and really talked about his love for hunting and him killing multiple numbers of birds and animals and snarking about different people in his life that these days would be totally inappropriate to do. However, these were his journals, and I was trying to stick as close to his original journals as possible. And one other great influence that I wanted to bring up was that once I really realized how complicated Audubon was, this linear approach was not going to work. And it had to be layered, and it had to be an exploration of with all these facts placed in correct places, but let the viewer and the reader try to figure out what was going on and not me explaining matters. And I remember, just as a small anecdote, that when I was a teenager, I was very confused, and in my confusion, I acted out. And when I acted out, my mother would carefully put me in a chair and stare at a blank wall and tell me to chill down. And whilst doing that, why don't you just close your eyes and pretend that everything around you is the opera, and it's a theatrical event, and just use it as a form of entertainment. And I had never been to an opera, and I don't know if she had at this point either. But that term opera kept coming to mind. And then when we moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, about 30 years ago, my husband and I built our home, and turns out it's about 5 miles from the International Outdoor Opera here in Santa Fe. And we have come to love going to it because of the way these epic historic dramas are played out on a stage, and they are circular in manner, that they don't go, they're extremely entertaining and yet very poignant, and they draw at human emotion in a deep way. And that kind of structure is how I kept thinking Audubon's life is so operatic. I have to kind of build a book that plays on these layers and layers of history, and try not to explain too much, but let the reader get lost in it and figure it out and come to their own conclusions.
It's fascinating to think about Audubon as an operatic figure. We would love that, I think. He's certainly an interesting historical figure. He was a remarkable artist, as I think we all agree. I think he was, and I agree with you, I think he's a very good writer. But then there's the other side of Audubon, and I think we need to confront that one. At various times in his life, he was a slaveholder. He was dismissive of the abolitionist movement. He engaged in some disgraceful behaviors toward indigenous peoples, grave robbing, skull collecting, that kind of thing. I mean, there's nothing really new about all that. It's been hidden in plain sight for years. But most people tended not to talk about that. They just gave him a pass as being, well, he was a man of his time, and let it go at that. But in the past few years, and I think now in the 2020s, we're beginning to see and read Audubon a bit differently, quite a bit differently, frankly. And in your long and unfolding relationship with Audubon, how have you come to read him? How have you tried to make sense of him as a subject that you are dealing with, writing about, and coming to terms with?
Well, it didn't take me too long to get highly frustrated with the man. And this burning anger and frustration is what fueled me throughout the 10 years. Mm-hmm. And he's determined, he's talented, he's complicated, and he's very, very worthy of reexamination, particularly because he is such a rich, unique American figure. And he forces history of the United States to be reexamined for all that he did. And I think that's why his life is so important right now. And it is, as you mentioned, scholars have known of his background, but it was hidden in so many ways, or not talked about until recently. And your book came out, definitely revealing a lot of that history. And then a later book that was written by Daniel Peterson, and he focused on the Missouri River journals, was perhaps, and Greg, you might clarify, was the one piece of research that acknowledged that new journals were found from the Missouri River. Mm-hmm. And that is where heretofore scholars had not yet seen. And that's when we learned that Audubon actually did rob graves. And then the family did try to hide it and change the subject and turn him into an environmentalist. And so his complication, I believe, is not something to avoid, but to really use as a speaking point in restoring American history, and really taking a look at the people who are creative geniuses, but they also are very complicated, as many of the leadership of this country have been and are today.
No, I think you're right. And I think that, some of the behaviors Audubon engaged in, particularly his scientific behaviors, you alluded to the grave robbing, the skull collecting of indigenous people in the upper Midwest. That was considered good science back in the 19th century. And Audubon was not by any means alone in that. And so I think it's not a question of saying, yes, he was just another scientist, a man of his time, giving him and everybody else a pass. But I think, as you say, to put that into a context, to engage it, to question it, to see the confounding sides of what he is emblematic of in that time. Let me turn over the question about you, Krista, the artist. And you say, and I think you say very emphatically, that you're an artist, but also want to be an activist. And so you are. So you are working very closely with Indigenous people in your Santa Fe region. And I think beginning to reach out more broadly than that, as this book will do. Where do you think Audubon the person, but Audubon the organization with which you're involved, fit in with your sense of the artist as activist? Do you feel that you carry Audubon as a burden, or perhaps as a source of inspiration here?
Well, I think I have both, and I think it's a matter of balancing the extremes in working with him.
Yes.
I believe that we need to continue talking about him as a character because he is so American. There's so many unique and rich and complicated parts of his life that Americans embrace. Guns, notoriety, accomplishment at whatever cost. And artists have to think about this all the time in terms of how far am I willing to go in order to produce my work? And where does it stop when it becomes unethical or not? You know, when do I quit working in the darkroom with all the chemicals and pouring it into my septic tank versus trying another method of making imagery? It's a question that we have to ask as creative artists, especially when we produce material that has an environmental consequence to it. My current thinking about Audubon societies and Audubon the man are directly linked to helping birds return to this landscape and to help heal the landscape so that they can return. And so the Audubon Society has a long tradition of working to restore habitat. The question is where's the habitat and who does it benefit? And how can the National Audubon Society and all Audubon centers that have land that they manage, how can they broaden their audiences and embrace Indigenous knowledge into that? And it really does mean working directly with the tribes from that area. And I did government-to-government consultation work regarding the Grand Canyon National Park and Dr. Dave Warren. And I understand the process of working in a formal way with tribes in order to get a partnership that's built on trust to happen. And I do believe that that is the method that the National Audubon Society and the local chapters need to do, is to build meaningful relationship with local tribes so that management of these landscapes can together bring back more birds. It will only benefit the birds. And that's where I am moving into the spaces more and more. I have worked with Indigenous tribes in the past, but there is so much more work to do in this area in order to recover the landscape so birds can return.
Well, I hope you keep doing the work, as we all should. I have a lot more questions for you, but I'm sure everybody else does too, some of our friends on Zoom. And I just want to take a moment to thank you for answering the questions that I've had, but also invite Kayla Hopper to bring in some of the Zoom participants and let them ask their questions. So Kayla, as they say, over to you.
Thank you both for a really interesting conversation. One, I'm just going to start with a comment that someone had from Rosalind Reamer, which says, I think an opera about Audubon is a brilliant idea. So you really sparked something with the opera. Daniel Lewis asks, how do we reconcile Audubon's name being integral to the actual name of the Venerable Society and countless other entities with his name, parks, schools, organizations, etc.? Do either of you want to comment on that?
Well, I will very briefly. I think it's important to understand that Audubon did not found or become involved in the Audubon Society. He died in 1851. The Audubon Societies didn't come into existence until the 1890s, first part of the 20th century. And I think that was a time that a lot of people wanted to embrace Audubon, and embrace one image of Audubon as the naturalist, as the Birdman. And frankly, at a time when I think a lot of white people were very happy not to think about slavery. This is the post-Reconstruction era in both North and South. A lot of people were willing just to kind of let that go. And therefore, Audubon seemed, I think to many people, like a more, what shall I say, sanitized person. And I think from that, there are Audubon parks, there are Audubon streets, there are Audubon towns all across the United States. And that was, I think, a reflection of that first wave of, I'll call it Audubonania. And yet now, I think in our time, a little over a century later, we're having again to reflect on Audubon, not just the name, not just the symbolism, not just the brand, as it were, but the human being. And that becomes a much more challenging, frankly, much more disturbing process.
I believe that it's really important to understand the history, but not only intellectually, but to have conversations about what values one wants to uphold with that Audubon name, and what values does one want to reevaluate and change. And so I believe the conversation is vital wherever there is a name of Audubon attached to a city street, a park, or a national organization. It is so worthy of historic reevaluation and looking at the facts so that the broader community can decide. And I hope that with information that people learn and read about will better inform them rather than just a quick reaction to slavery, which of course is a very undesirable event in US history, but it was absolutely the foundation of this country, and the economy of this country was built off of it. And so once that is fully embraced, then we can decide what would be a better name and what to do with the Audubon brand, if you will.
Well, thank you both for contributing to that conversation with your work. The next question is from Rachel Bolton. She starts by saying, thanks for this wonderful conversation. Looking forward to getting a copy of the book. I'm thinking about the relationship between Ellrick's photography and the landscapes that make their way into the birds of America. Though most place the birds in some sort of context, on a branch surrounded by flowers and leaves, there are only a few in which the background is fully realized. Can either of you speak to how Audubon chose which to illustrate?
Well, I'll just jump in a little bit. I think that Gregory probably knows a little more about this than I do, but there are not many where the landscape is actually part of his watercolor. And if it does appear in the print of the elephant portfolio, then that would have been something that Havel would have placed on it in later processes. Audubon himself generally did not paint the backgrounds. He hired assistants to do so. And so it depends, I think, depending if the assistant was with him whilst he was painting this watercolor or not. I think it, because they are so few in the whole body of his work, that's when it becomes interesting to me, when they actually are seen and you can see what is going on behind the bird and the culture of people in them. Greg, do you know why he didn't do this more often?
Well, I think Audubon wanted to locate the birds in nature. He wanted to depict them, as he put it, size of life and full size. There's only one Audubon painting that shows a human being, and that is the snowy egret in South Carolina. There's a little figure carrying a gun. Some people speculate that's a self-portrait of Audubon. He did include himself, or at least a picture of a hunter, in his initial painting watercolor of the golden eagle. It's a hunter crawling across a log with an eagle on its back and a gun and a hatchet. It's a very emotional seeming and evocative image, kind of in one corner, but that gets taken out of the final engraving, so it's not there. Otherwise, what we see in Audubon are a few distant cityscapes, Charleston, South Carolina, for instance. But I think his larger project and his larger sense of what he wanted to do was not to have the birds in a specific place. They are the birds of America, and he makes a kind of national possession of them that way, but not in a particular locale.
Cindy Morgan Jaffe doesn't have a question, but she just comments, "Congratulations, I'm grateful for this work and for all who have helped to make it happen." And I know we are too, seeing how you bring art and history together and in the cause of the environment is a great thing to see, and we're happy to have helped in that process. We do have one other question that's very specific. Do you know where Audubon painted the ivory-billed woodpecker? David Tanner asks. Yeah, that's good. That's a tough one. How much?
Well, actually, I would need to go get the book that it has published about it. I need to go to another room, but actually, one can find the year and the place when he painted it. In my book, it should have the date of when it happened, and
you maybe have a suggestion for how they can find this information?
I have a bibliography in my book of all the resources that I went to, and in my bibliography there is a book that does talk about the specific prints and the history of the number of editions they were, when they were printed, where they were printed, and who did the background. And so I would encourage you to go to my bibliography, which has that information, and resource that. In much of it, I didn't go into digital sites for that. I bought books and did it through the actual hard copy of the book to get to it. So that's how you can find that information.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Sorry, I'm just, a couple of other people have comments. David Tanner said, thank you. The bird has a sad history. And Daniel Lewis notes that in the ornithological biography, he notes that he first saw it in Florida and notes other places. So it was perhaps a composite, which again is interesting when you think about, as you said, the lack of full backgrounds in many of his pictures. Well, thank you both. We are now at 8 o'clock. And so we'll be wrapping up now, but I want to thank you both for joining us tonight and for having such a wonderful conversation. And I want to thank everybody in the audience for joining us tonight. Please join us again next Monday, November 1st, when we'll be hosting a conversation between Cornelia Dayton and Henry Louis Gates Jr. on Dayton's groundbreaking article recently published in the New England Quarterly, which reveals details about the latter years of Phyllis Wheatley's life after she married her husband, John, and became Phyllis Peters. It's sure to be an interesting conversation, so please join us for that one. You can find more information and registration for this program, as well as several others we have coming up, on our website at americanantiquarian.org. And to get updates about upcoming programs, check the website, follow us on social media, or sign up for the mailing list through the link that I think Amanda will provide in the chat. And other than that, thank you again for coming, and we hope we'll see you all again. And thank you, Krista and Greg, so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Thanks a
you.
lot.